Hello, everyone. It's Mr. G here, and I just wanted to record this brief lecture on Zitkala Sa. Zitkala Sa's name in the Dakota language means redbird, hence the image that you can see here on the book cover in front of you. But she changed her name, or I should say her name was changed to Gertrude Simmons. And later, when she got married, her name became Gertrude Simmons Bonin. And then later in life, she insisted on going by her original Dakota name, Zitkala Sa. Now, I think this change in name is very appropriate because a lot of what Zitkala Sa was writing about was the concept of assimilation and later in life resisting against assimilation into a dominant culture. So this story begins in the 1800s. This is post-U.S. Civil War. And if you are familiar with this historical period in U.S. history, this was a time that is often labeled as the Indian Wars after the Civil War. And the so-called Indian Wars were really a quest for expansion for the U.S. empire and for white Christian Protestant culture. So what was happening is many large tracts of native land was being taken over and fought over by force and won by force and then adopted into the United States. This happened all throughout the West and the Midwest section of North America. So where Zitkala Sa was living was on the Dakota land in what we now call South Dakota. But when she was a child, it wasn't yet a state, so it wasn't the state of South Dakota yet. It became a state during her lifetime. So you have to recognize that when she was a child, her family was essentially, they were survivors of war. Today we might even use the word refugees on their own land, and that the generation ahead of her, one or two generations before her, were absolutely decimated. Survivors were hungry, crops were decimated, land was burnt, the animals such as buffalo that they hunted were either driven out or slaughtered, and people were hungry and a little bit desperate. So when white missionaries, approached Zitkala Sa's mother and family and basically said, okay, we can take your child in and give her a new life in a missionary school and teach her English, and she'll adopt American culture and live in a more so-called modern and, let's say, advanced by their terms, society. It would be very hard to say no because it was difficult to see a pathway forward for the Dakota people to survive. So it was a survival mechanism. So as much as it pained Zitkala Sa's mother, she ended up sending her to a boarding school. And we read a little bit, a few excerpts from this segment of the book where she went into the boarding school. She was forced to cut that long, beautiful hair she had. And that hair was really a symbol of, her culture and traditions. But it didn't stop there. The students, the children, were forced to learn English, to give up their spiritual practices, their cultural practices, and to adopt Christianity, Protestantism in particular, and essentially white culture. And it's important to know that these kids were cut off from their culture by force. Okay, so later in life, Zitkala Sa wrote an essay called "Why I Am a Pagan," and she's arguing that a religion that promotes, tolerance and peace and brotherhood wouldn't be committing some of the atrocities that she witnessed herself. After Zitkala Sa received her own education, she went on to become a teacher, and then she witnessed other young Native children experiencing some of the same traumas that she herself experienced. So she decided to move on from that and become an advocate and a writer. So this is when she started writing her essays and stories that promoted her culture. She wanted to preserve Native stories and storytelling. She also became a musician with the idea of preserving some of the traditions of storytelling through music, and she wrote many books and essays along the way. She also became a political activist. She worked in Utah and South Dakota to preserve Native American sovereignty and to prevent boarding schools from cutting children off from their cultures and their families. Then later in life, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and again worked to preserve Native sovereignty. And then she went on to work for women's rights in general. She actually formed a multicultural, multiracial coalition in order to protect women from abuse and to give them rights that they didn't have at the time. So, today we talk a lot about, resisting oppression and advocacy and standing up to, white supremacy. But this really is an example of someone who was doing this work and writing these books and promoting, advocacy and activist work in her life back in the late 1800s and turn of the century to the 1900s. So I hope you learned a little bit about Zitkala Sa and the historical context. I hope this helped you to understand the text a little bit, and I'll see you on the next lecture.